host, Nick Jikomes, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Paul Cisek. Paul is a neuroscientist and professor at the University of Montreal, where his lab studies sensorimotor integration and decision-making in non-human primates as well as humans. And he thinks a lot about, decision-making, perception, cognition, all of these things, what the brain is doing and how and why it's doing it the way that it does it. And he thinks a lot about evolution. So he contextualizes his neuroscientific work inside a framework of evolutionary thinking about how the brain evolved over time, how its structures, came to be and were built on top of the things that came before in evolutionary history. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the evolutionary history of brains and nervous systems. We talked about what the earliest nervous systems look like and some of the most primitive organisms that had nervous systems hundreds of millions of years ago. We talked about how the nervous system changed and became, what we're familiar with today over evolutionary time, how different structures like the hypothalamus and the spinal cord and the cortex and all these things came into the picture over the course of evolution, and how all of these things work. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about things like behavior, escape behaviors, getting away from threats and predators, foraging behaviors, finding food and nutrients in the environment, how all of these things connect with the ability of an animal to control its state, thinking about the brain as a fancy mechanism for state control rather than as a way for organisms to represent the external world in the way that people often think about it. And so we talked a lot about things like perception and attention and decision making. What do these things mean? Is there really a difference, and what is the difference between sensation and perception and cognition? Does the brain do each of these things one at a time and pass information, between sensation parts of the brain and perception parts of the brain and cognition parts of the brain, and then to the motor systems to execute behavior? Or does the brain work in a different way? Are all of these things sort of intermingled and happening in parallel with one another? So if you're interested in what the brain does and how it does it, if you're interested in how the brain evolved and how the evolutionary context that brains came out of influences how they work, this will be a really interesting episode for you. We talked about how, a lot of times people think about the brain using concepts that really come from the tradition of psychology and thinking about human mentation rather than thinking about evolution and behavior and coming at it from that angle. If you're interested in perception and what perception is and why we have perceptions at all, this will be a really interesting episode. It's, again, grounded in evolutionary thinking and behavioral thinking, and Paul is a neuroscientist. At times, though, the conversation verged on the philosophical. And so this was a really, really interesting conversation that I had a lot of fun having. I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in the brain, especially people who are, aspiring or practicing neuroscientists. I think it's really useful to listen to what Paul has to say and really start to think about the brain in evolutionary terms first, rather than thinking about it in other ways, using things like computer metaphors, because ultimately everything in biology is evolutionary. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, as has been famously said in the past. And I think this is just a really thought-provoking and interesting discussion. This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it with the first meal of each day, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure, and vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. And there's even evidence indicating that vitamin D deficiency is correlated with more severe cases of COVID-19 in those who get infected. Every time I go into the doctor each year for a checkup, I'm always told that vitamin D deficiency is very common and I should be supplementing on a daily basis. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase. As always, if you enjoy the content I'm producing, please like, share, and subscribe. Do not forget to check out the links in the episode description, including to mindandmatter.substack.com, and your support is appreciated. And with that, here's my conversation with Dr. Paul Cisek. What your scientific research focuses on?
Okay, sure. Thanks for inviting me, first of all. So I'm a neuroscientist at the University of Montreal, and I study, decision-making, but in the context of sort of sensorimotor control. So it's more decisions about which way to run on a soccer field, and not so much as to whether to play soccer or a different sport. Not really the abstract decisions, but rather the more sort of concrete moment-to-moment decisions. And I studied that in animals and humans, and with experimental work, and also a lot of computational modeling. So I'm actually a computer scientist by background, and then later I got into sort of theoretical neuroscience, mathematical modeling, and then only later came to do experimental work. And now I sort of combine those interests in my research day to day.
I see. So you do work on primates, monkeys and humans.
Yes, monkeys and humans. Yes, and using techniques like neural recordings, functional imaging, with colleagues, as well as many behavioral studies. Just looking at what decisions people make, how do they act, etc. Really, whatever techniques that are available to me that bear upon questions that interest me.
So why do you focus on primates? Why not use other model organisms that give you more tools?
Well, frankly, it's a bit historical. It's because I started out interested in human cognition, and gradually came to realize that a lot of human cognition is based on sensorimotor control, and so I addressed these kinds of questions in the kinds of animals where one addresses these kinds of questions, like humans and primates that are sort of have the sophistication to do these things. But I realize now that I could have gone about it very differently and studied fish and studied salamanders and such, because a lot of the questions I think that I'm addressing are actually relevant for those animals, and they're perfectly capable of doing it. If we set up the right kind of experiment. So it's a bit historical. I sort of got into this, and sometimes I wonder whether I should go and study the Amphioxus, which is this really fascinating creature that lives in the water and has a lot of the nervous system that we have, but it's much simpler and perhaps more accessible to really understand. So yeah, it's a bit historical. It's because of my own training and how I've sort of progressed in learning these things.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to talk about the primate brain, but I think we'll get there later in the discussion. One of the things that distinguishes you from many systems neuroscientists who think about things in a computational way, who think about how the brain works in a fully intact behaving animal, is you have a lot of phylogenetic and evolutionary knowledge, and you sort of use an evolutionary lens to think about what the brain is doing based on how it evolved and where it came from, basically. And so I'm actually hoping we can start with a discussion, about maybe you could describe some of the earliest nervous systems that we know about and what they looked like and how they worked and what they were actually doing for some of those early organisms long time ago.
Sure. So I've sort of been exposed to ideas that suggest that essentially behavior, when we think about behavior, we think about usually our own behavior and relatively complex behavior, where there's a lot of pre-planning, etc. But a number of people for really over 100 years have been suggesting that we should really look at behavior as a kind of extension of metabolic control, basic physiological control that all living animals engage in. That essentially is about maintaining your internal state, in a desirable state where you have the nutrients you need and you're not, your temperature is correct and you're not being eaten. And behavior is an aspect of that. It's just that an aspect that, rather than employing machinery within the body, extends out into the environment, at least briefly. And so, for example, to control certain nutrients or certain compounds within a cell, there's certain chemical pathways that can do that, like the Krebs cycle and other kinds of physiological pathways. But to control your nutrient state, you could also just move around in the world. Like if you're in a place where there isn't a lot of some nutrient that you need, well, just move around, swim around randomly, and you're likely to find yourself in a place where there's more of whatever it is that you need. And so the idea of acting so as to influence your state is kind of a fundamental feature of all living organization. And everybody who studies physiology knows this and talks about this way. And many people study animals think this way. Psychologists tend not to, because that kind of feedback loop of behavior is kind of hard to see in human behavior. But it's likewise, like the things that I do ultimately are ways of dealing with maintaining my state in a good, desirable state. I'm well fed, not threatened, etc. And so many of the things we do, they may be very convoluted and very long term, but in the end, it's all about that. So in that sense, I would say even before nervous system, there is a fundamental kind of architecture, this kind of feedback control architecture, that is the basis of behavior and physiology. And so the nervous systems are an elaboration of that second type of control, the one that extends out into the world. Although, of course, much of the nervous system is also about internal physiological control. So, the whole endocrine system, the enteric nervous system, these are more internally concerned. But our nervous system, and much of the nervous system expanding sort of out in through the environment, becomes very complicated and very sophisticated and convoluted because the environment is so sophisticated and convoluted. So in a sense, nervous systems, that's what they fundamentally do. I think they exert control. And the first neurons are actually a specialization of skin, of the epithelium, to sort of maintain certain integrity, for example, of the membrane. If you're come in contact with something, you want to withdraw from it. Even single cell organisms do this. But nervous systems of larger multicellular organisms help to do this in a more coordinated fashion. So these early neural nets of early multicellular organisms were specializations of the external layer that did some of this kind of behavioral control. And one would be tempted to call it stimulus response, but in a sense, it's really a control of state. It's maintaining the state against external perturbations and such.
I see. So we can think of behavior as really being the same thing as metabolic control. It's a way of controlling the internal states, ultimately of the inside of an organism's cells. So even if we think of a mostly immobile single-celled organism that can't really move, it can sort of just float around in whatever soup it lives in. It still has to get rid of waste and ingest nutrients and do the classic metabolic stuff that we think about when we think about cells. And then we can imagine there's bacteria and little motile single-celled organisms that have organs like flagella, and they can literally sort of swim around, and they're basically following concentration gradients. But again, it's for the purpose of for doing metabolism, for keeping their metabolic
state. Like if you imagine a sort of a freely floating organism of some sort that doesn't have much of even effector system, it could just inflate slightly and it'll go up, right? In water, it'll deflate, it'll go down. I mean, there's certain control policies that one can do without much of a nervous system or muscles or anything. And yes, I think that's it. I mean, it's more complicated now, of course, because there's other things that we do than just metabolism. I mean, there's also reproduction and defense and such. But yes, I think fundamentally, that's what it's all really about. And then everything else is on top of that. And I think to me, the point is really well made by the title of William Powers' book in the 1970s, 1973, entitled "Behavior: The Control of Perception." And what he essentially said is that's what behavior is about. It's not about responding to the world. It's about controlling your state in the world. And perception is your way of evaluating your state, and action is your way of influencing that state through the world by taking advantage of certain predictable contingencies between what you do and what happens to your state. And so it's sort of complementing the environment so that the entire system that you are, it maintains itself and is, again, far from danger and satisfied in terms of nutrients, and it achieves the things it needs.
Mm-hmm. And so some of the earliest nervous systems, before there were actually brains, we had these sort of organisms had these neural nets that were more diffuse, I guess you could say. Yeah. And the first neurons, you said, were actually derived from skin cells. So the nervous system is sort of starting literally at the interface between the organism and the environment. And sort of with that in the back of our minds, when we think about the most basic, most fundamental behaviors, if behavior is about controlling perception and it's about state control, the first neurons are literally at the interface between the inside of the organism and the external environment. What are the most primitive or basic behaviors? Should we be thinking about feeding and foraging when we think about the earliest behaviors?
That would be a big part of it, I think. The temperature regulation and sort of osmolarity regulation, those were part of it too, and they still are, of course. One thing I'd want to add, though, is that when we say neurons appeared as a specialization, I originally it wasn't so much neurons per se. It was more that the exterior cells had certain kinds of receptors that would, let's say, open when there was deformation of the membrane, allowing calcium in. And the cellular response to that would be to contract the other end of the neuron, of the cell, right? So it really had both a sensory and a motor role. And these sort of pluripotent cells sort of were among the epithelial cells. And they had this kind of simple sort of withdrawal reflex-like function. But then later, some of them specialized to be really, focus on the sensory and others on the contractile. And then finally, some of them just took care of the signaling between the two, right? So if you have cells that are specialized for sensation, others that are specialized for contraction, with some channel between them or some contact between them, eventually, apparently, this is, I'm just saying what I've read from other people. The sensory ones specialize further into ones that are just sensory and others that are just sort of signaling. And those signaling ones then were useful because they could signal to many, many parts of the body at once and coordinate behavior. And that eventually became that neural net that's still diffuse. And so the very distinction between perception and action here is actually emerges out of this control function. So, when I say the title of that book, Behavior to Control of Perception, perception there is in a very general sense. It's nothing like conscious perception. It's nothing like representation of the world. It's just some kind of state control. I think fundamentally that's what Powers and others were getting at. But again, these ideas are much older than that. John Dewey wrote about this 120 years ago, and I'm sure others have said this even earlier.
So, one of the things that you wrote about is, what the fundamental purpose of the nervous system is. And that's basically what we just started to talk about. But you wrote in one of your papers that the fundamental function of the brain is not to build knowledge about the world, but rather to complement and counteract the dynamics of the world such that the entire organism-environment system stays within desirable states and away from undesirable ones. So can you just elaborate on that a little bit more and maybe contrast it with other ways that people often think about the fundamental purpose of nervous systems?
Well, I would say that that's essentially that phrase is essentially my way to say what Powers and Dewey and Ashby and Piaget, a psychologist, said, many years before I was born. Now, within the context of that complementing, the aspect of, how do you complement the environment? How do you establish that kind of control? Well, you have to take advantage of certain regularities in the environment, certain reliable sort of contingencies that, for example, if you find yourself where there is not a lot of a nutrient, well, then movement, even random movement, is likely to be helpful because the distribution is such that there's probably more elsewhere. So there's certain sort of laws of nutrient distribution or physics that need to be there in the environment in order for the organism to find that control policy. But that's not to say, of course, that brains don't build knowledge, because along the way to find and then to use that control policy, knowledge of the world will be useful in many cases. It's just not the origins of it, right? It's not where it began. Where it begins. It's not the foundation on which it's built. It's built on a foundation of feedback control, again, as many people have said, and then things like, knowledge about the world, abstract thinking and such. That's built on top of that, and it's never free of that. It's always within that context, but it still has all of those sophisticated properties. I mean, we do learn languages that convey information in ways that are very indirect, and we do learn things that are very much disconnected from day-to-day activity. But ultimately, all that stuff is built within this context of control systems. And again, the thing is, when we study humans, it's might be difficult to appreciate that control. But again, that's pretty sophisticated. That's many layers of hierarchical control systems away from those really simple animals that just swim around and get nutrients. And so, yeah, you mentioned foraging. Yeah, that's part of it. How do you find yourself in a good place? So filter feeders do this by sort of floating around, again, rising in the water column or falling in the water column, depending on the time of day, because that has certain consequences of how much nutrient you'll find. So that's a very simple kind of control that many animals do without much of a nervous system.
And so, when we think about the earliest nervous systems, so first of all, just to help orient people in time, when did the earliest nervous systems evolve? And so as we progress from that period of time to, say, the period where centralized brains started to evolve, what were some of the behavioral innovations that were going along with the centralization of the nervous system?
So my understanding is that nervous systems appeared after we diverged from sponges. So that's about 700 million years ago. But there's a lot of course, ambiguity in trying to nail down the exact date. So it's likely that is when nervous systems neurons first appeared, long before a brain, and then brains appeared, actually, like a centralized brain appeared a couple of separate times along various lineages along that pathway, where the vertebrate brain, the chordate brains, are one example, but there are other examples among mollusks, among arthropods, etc., where you can say there's a centralized brain of some sort, but that was independent, essentially. Now, there's also a very fascinating debate going on these days about comb jellies. I don't know if you're familiar with comb jellies, but they're amazing creatures. Just look at them, and you'll see why. They look like an alien spaceship from somebody with a really good imagination. They're these amazing things. They look like jellyfish, and they have neurons. They have nervous systems, but they're very strange nervous systems. And one idea that's become prominent in recent years, it's debated highly, is that they developed their neurons completely independently, that they actually split off from our lineage before the sponges. And so before anybody had neurons, and they came up with a nervous system on their own, a separate nervous system, like an alien being, except, here on Earth. And there's some good evidence for that. It's highly debated, however. I don't know what the reality is, but it is possible that nervous systems actually evolved twice, once in comb jellies and once in sort of the Eumetazoan, or rather bilaterian branch of life. Sorry, not bilaterian, I should say Eumetazoan, including jellyfish and bilateral animals like us, which appear to have inherited a common nervous system. Anyway, so that's an interesting side bit for those who are interested in really early animals. There's a fascinating series of studies debating this issue. But then the actual centralized brains, again, they appear a number of times, rather sparsely, actually. There's a lot of animals, a lot of branches that don't have centralized brains. But on our lineage, the lineage that eventually produced humans, it happened in chordates, at least in chordates, probably about 650, maybe close to 700 million years ago, and had a particular sort of genetic origins.
And when we think about those early chordates, so primitive organisms that are in the branch of the evolutionary tree that eventually gives rise to us and other animals, when we think about what they were doing and we think about their brains, what did their brains start to have? What innovations evolved that earlier nervous systems didn't have? And what things did they lack that we are familiar with our brains and mammals and animals walking around today?
One thing that seems to have happened is a notochord, which creates sort of kind of like a spinal cord, essentially a tube structure. One proposal is that early bilaterian animals along our branch had a kind of a plate on the top surface of the body of neurons that somewhere along the line folded into a tube. And it's unclear when that happened exactly. Starfish actually have something like this, but it's unclear whether that's their own invention or such. It is clear that by the time you get to a branch called cephalochordates, that a lot of that structure was set in place. So cephalochordates is a branch that split off from us about 650 million years ago, I think. And that includes this creature called the Amphioxus that I mentioned earlier, which is remarkable in having a lot of the structure you will find in vertebrates. And so it has things like a spinal cord. It has a single eye patch that it's not eyes, but it's probably homologous to our eyes. But at that time, it was just a single patch of cells, photosensitive cells, that projected downstream to what is a hypothalamus-like thing, and as well as something that's a bit like what's called the tectum in vertebrates or the superior colliculus in mammals. It appears that those structures were there in these very early animals, but not really the telencephalon. So the telencephalon includes things like the cerebral cortex, hippocampus, basal ganglia, a lot of the structures that become really prominent in mammals and many vertebrates. The cephalochordate doesn't seem to have it, although there was a study a couple of years ago that suggested some of the cellular precursors are actually there, and they're where you'd expect them to be if there was something in our common ancestor that eventually sort of mushroomed out. And here's actually, I think, a very interesting fact that I learned when I read this stuff is that this telencephalon, which again includes cerebral cortex, hippocampus, basal ganglia, etc., It actually is just an outgrowth of part of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus was there. It was one of the earliest structures. In fact, Thurston Lacali, who studied the Amphioxus a lot, described them often as it's a hypothalamus attached to a spinal cord. And again, the hypothalamus, even today, is this sort of major source of metabolic control, right? Through endocrine secretions. And again, these creatures had a lot of these systems. But then it just has a kind of a downstream projection to the spinal cord, which deals with the outside world. And at some point, it developed better control of control of the sort of interaction with the outside world through structures like the tectum, and then later the telencephalon. But fundamentally, again, that hypothalamic controller was sort of the first. It's really the first recognizable structure that we see in these animals in evolution that seems to have been there pretty much almost as soon as neurons or a centralized brain. Certainly, by the time of a centralized brain, I think that would be it. So again, and that's the top level control, maintaining fundamental physiological variables in desirable ranges.
Yeah, and so can you talk about the hypothalamus a little bit more? You already hinted at some of what it's doing and how it's different from other parts of the brain that we'll talk about that are often said to do fancier things basically, but it has a lot of endocrine controls built into it. It's using and sensing a lot of different hormones and things like this. Can you just talk about some of the basic control mechanisms that even those early hypothalamic structures were engaged in?
So a lot of it was like circadian rhythms already. There are parts of the hypothalamus. By the way, the retina apparently is also an outgrowth of the hypothalamus, as well as the pineal gland, which was the sort of original circadian rhythm detector. But mind you, I am not an expert in the hypothalamus. So the best I can do is tell you what I think I understand from the people who are experts. And so one person's work that I found sort of useful for understanding the evolution of these things is Detlev Arendt in Germany, who suggests that the original nervous systems had this kind of two parts: what he calls the apical nervous system, which was really about endocrine control, but also chemical sensation and photosensation and et cetera, and what he calls the blastoporal nervous system, and that which was more synaptic and sensorimotor control. And then the two of these things kind of partially merge, and where they merge is where you get the hypothalamus, and where they don't merge, the remaining of the sort of blastoporal systems becomes much of the rest of the nervous systems. So essentially, what they're suggesting is, and it's not just them, but others as well, is that there's a kind of a controller there that does the endocrine control, which is a lot of it is internal physiological, as well as some kind of sensorimotor control through the environment via in this stage, this mostly just the spinal cord, but also kind of the interaction between the two, like the control of circadian rhythms is not just control of whether you're going to sort of be very active or not very active, but also what kind of things you may want to what kind of interactions you may want to prioritize. And so one proposal, this I get from reading Thomas Hills and others, is that one of the things about foraging is there's the world near you and then there's the world far away. And they're kind of different, right? The thing that's near you is the kind of thing that you can ingest by just like sucking in water. And so that's local behavior. And when things are good, when you're in a good state in the world, within your environment, you're in a good neighborhood, say, then you kind of want to stay there. You kind of want to stay local. But if the local environment becomes depleted, maybe because you've sucked up all the good nutrients or maybe not that great to start with, then you want to go somewhere else. You want to move more large area. You want to cover a larger area. And Hills and others suggest that this was the original role of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which, as you probably know, is highly implicated in a lot of very important reward-related processing, reinforcement learning, etc. But they suggest that the original role was not in learning so much, but just regulating. When things are good, keep doing what you're doing and stay where you are. When things are not so good, when the levels of dopamine drop, that's a signal saying things are not so good. Go somewhere out there. Go out there and explore a little bit. Try to find a better place. And again, that is a role of fairly sort of hypothalamic, very ancient systems that are hypothalamic. Now, dopamine has taken on many other roles since then, but again, within that context. So again, that is still, and I still think that in the end, the top of the brain hierarchically is the hypothalamus, right? I mean, if you can engage in all kinds of sophisticated cognitive speculation, but in the end, if you're hungry or there's a fire, you're not going to deal with that first, right? And so again, I think, you can sort of say that there's a part of the hypothalamus that's doing a lot of this fundamental keeping you alive. And there's a part of it that specializes for keeping you alive through the world, essentially by dealing with what's out there.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about, so when we use this word state, the current state of an organism, how are structures like the hypothalamus actually, what is the state? What are the things that define the state in terms of what the hypothalamus is detecting? And naturally, if you just start talking about these things at all, other concepts very naturally emerge. So for example, if I sort of summarize what you were just saying, very basic aspects of behavior include, sensing the nutrient content of your environment. Maybe, I've got cells in my body that are sensing that, sugar's too low or something is too low and we need to replenish it. Then you obviously want to detect if those things are present outside of the body so that you can get them inside of the body to change the state, the nutrient composition inside your cells so that you can maintain, stay alive and maintain homeostasis. And, very naturally, when you deplete these nutrients from the environment by ingesting them, you have to detect that those nutrients are no longer there. Obviously, when they're there, it's good in the sense that you have something to suck in to replenish what's inside your body. When they're depleted, that's bad. And maybe it starts sending signals somehow to say, go somewhere else. And, very naturally, when you just sort of think about these very basic things, the metabolic state of the animal coupled to the environment via its sensory apparatuses, naturally leads you to talk about things being good or bad, or behavior being motivated or unmotivated. So how do we think about state and start to connect those concepts together?
Well, I think that's about right. I mean, there's certain, state is just a word that we use for all the variables that an animal needs to deal with, and what their current setting is. And some of them can be in a very wide range. Some of them have to be in a very specific range. And the challenge is to stay within those desirable regions of that multidimensional state space. But yes, to do that, you can be a little bit more sophisticated than just say, oh, my stomach is grumbling. You can use chemical sensation, for example, to tell what's out there. If I were to go out there and ingest, would it be good? Is there anything there worth ingesting? With vision, of course, same thing. If you're, some kind of a visually guided forager, then certain visual cues tell you that you're oriented towards food. Go start swimming forward, and open up your mouth or something. And so there is the dopamine example is actually kind of an example for it, because the dopamine is not so much your internal state as much as your intake rate, at least according to some hypotheses. So if it's the rate at which you're intaking nutrients is good, then you should keep doing it. If you're assuming you actually are hungry, which is in other hormones that will tell you that. So essentially, it's if things are going well, continue doing what you're doing. If things are not going well, seek another place, explore a little bit, etc. Now, one of the things that I think I've sort of neglected in the way I've described this stuff is just how fundamental predictive control is. So you can think about the animal detects that its state is suddenly depleted, and now it's time to go and find food, or it's getting cold. You need to find a warmer place. In fact, animals can do better than that. Even very simple single cellular animals do a lot of predictive control. And so they can essentially anticipate needs before they actually happen to be needs, because there are very predictable contingencies out in the world. When you drink a glass of water, you feel satisfied long before it could possibly affect your bloodstream, right? Simply because it's reliable. It's a no-brainer, right? That ingesting food will satisfy hunger, drinking water will satisfy thirst, etc. So a lot of this stuff is actually predictive, and Sterling and Lachlan described this as allostasis. The idea that it's not homeostasis, not just responding to perturbations and maintaining a controlled state, but rather allostasis, which is predictive, anticipating changes in state, et cetera. And you can see how that's particularly powerful once you have a nervous system with sensors that can look out in the world. You can see a fruit, and seeing the fruit doesn't satisfy your hunger, but it tells you what you need to do to satisfy the hunger, and so on. And I think Lisa Feldman Barrett's work really ties that in very nicely to actually what goes on in the nervous system when you do these kinds of things and when you deal with these kinds of things. So, but yes, I think this is really what you said. It's motivation for action. This is where the purpose of behavior really comes in. Is that behavior actually accomplishes these things that are important.
And so when we think about sort of nervous systems becoming more elaborate and increasing in complexity as we go forward in evolutionary time, and new organisms are evolving, one of the fundamental things that I suspect you'll talk about here is, as an organism becomes more mobile, more able to move through its environment, it's naturally going to encounter a greater diversity of environments. Right. So we can imagine very simple organisms, and they're just basically floating around in soup. And we can imagine, organisms that can kind of, swim with a little tail structure or something into new types of environments that the other organism will never find itself in. And then eventually, obviously, we get animals in the sort of traditional sense where, they have appendages or fins or whatever, and they can travel quite large distances. And so naturally, the longer you can travel, the further you can travel, the more diversity of environments you will encounter. And the more diversity of environments you encounter will then naturally require you to have more and more refined sensation abilities so that you can actually parse what's out in that more diverse set of environments. And so you need that if you're going to have the mobility to actually put yourself in those new environments. And so as we think about some of the earliest chordates and more primitive organisms that sort of just had a hypothalamus, and some other, what we'd call more primitive sensory elaborations, as time proceeds evolutionarily and we start getting structures that other people will have heard of, basal ganglia, hippocampus, cortex, what's going on in terms of the behavioral innovations and why those structures were necessitated, why those structures needed to evolve, and what precisely they're doing with respect to motor control and more and more refined sensory abilities?
So I think one concept which is really useful here is the idea of affordances, which comes from James Gibson, who was a perceptual psychologist in the 70s. And the idea is that the world contains opportunities for action for particular organisms. So, for example, a tree branch is a place of support for a bird, but not for me. I mean, it's a really thick branch and it's not too high off the ground. A small hole is shelter for a mouse, but it could be a source of food for a cat. And so the point is that there are certain things that if an animal is capable of certain abilities, motor abilities. Then there are certain things in the world that just are opportunities to do stuff. Now, that's true for very simple animals. Fish, for example, certain coral formations may be a shelter for a small fish and a source of food for a big fish. The idea that affordances exist, but are specific to an animal is important, because you can now see how very, very simple animals did not have affordances for sophisticated interaction because they simply didn't have the sensorimotor machinery to actually make use of it. But as the sensorimotor machinery expands in its sophistication a little bit, it sort of enables certain kinds of interactions, and therefore discovers those sort of affordances in the sense of a reliable consequence of taking a certain interaction. So, for example, very simple organisms may have interacted with. So when you say as animals get more mobile, they encounter more complex worlds, I think you meant kind of that rather than, simple animals sort of stumble into, because a simple animal can stumble into a complex world and get eaten in seconds, right? That's not the point. I think the point is that as simple animals get more sophisticated, they discover the additional complexities of the world. So another concept that's useful here is Umwelt, which is early ethologists suggested, von Exkluh suggested that animals live within a certain kind of a world of what's meaningful to them, what's relevant to them. And it's very different for a fish as for a bird, as for a mammal, terrestrial mammal. And it's related. It's the idea that there's a certain set of interactions that are possible for that animal in that particular world. And that is what they use to exert control over their state and the environment. Again, the mouse will run into the hole when threatened because it affords shelter, as long as it's not too small and not so big that the cat can get in, right? And so animals sort of need to discover the affordances that are relevant for the kinds of interactions of which they're capable. And I think what happens in evolution is this is kind of a gradual sort of symbiotic expansion. The nervous system gets more sophisticated, permitting the exploitation of more abstract or more advanced or a wider variety of affordances, which then supports that and allows more sophisticated things still. So, animals can run up a tree and discover a whole world of opportunities if they have the right nervous system to take advantage of. And so I think that's essentially what happens in evolution, is this sort of gradual extension of the sort of closed loop control further and further into more complex world and to take advantage of things. You and I perceive a bicycle in a way that, because we know how to ride a bicycle, but that's not animals that don't have the geometry and the motor skills. They don't. It isn't that affordance isn't there for them. So I think this concept is really, really fundamental from very early animals, and it still continues to be fundamental now.
I see. So just to riff on that with a super simplistic example, we'll use the tree example. As an organism evolves and it becomes able to move its body so it can get into a new type of environment, essentially it's now in a new niche. There's a new world of possibility that the animal's not particularly well adapted to exploit. In fact, it might not even be well adapted to detect what's in the environment to exploit. But as soon as it starts to get into some kind of new environment, some new evolutionary niche, now you have the ability for selective pressure to come into the mix, such that its nervous system can learn how to parse that environment on the sensory side, learn how to move through that new environment on the motor side, and then that's going to provide selective pressure for new innovations to evolve. And this process just can happen over and over and over again as animals just expand into more and more environments.
Yeah, and I think one thing that needs to be appreciated is just how many fail, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when animals got out on land, part of the advantage of getting out on land is you're getting out of the water, which was teeming with all kinds of predators. But you get out on land, there's all kinds of new challenges now, and major innovations have to be developed in order to overcome those challenges. And the fact is, many species just didn't make it, right? We see only the ones that survived, and it looks like, wow, they adapted. They said, we need to have we need to breathe air. Well, let's develop some lungs. We need to enlarge our vision. Let's develop bigger eyes. But the fact is, that's just the ones that didn't succumb to the selection pressure that killed off all of the others. And so again, it's like pushing the edges, pushing yourself into a new niche, and then exploring in all kinds of ways, many of them failures, but some of them happening to stumble on ways of dealing with that new niche, and now opening up a whole new world of opportunities. In fact, if you look at sort of the progression of evolution, you have dramatic periods of innovation at certain times, and it's often kind of simple. A meteor fell and knocked out all large predators, including all dinosaurs. That creates a lot of opportunities now for mammals to fill those niches. But some of it is harder to tell. Sometimes things happen simply because a new predator entered the environment, or climate changed, and so major innovations happen. There's examples of this throughout evolutionary history. And again, I think animals are doing this all the time. They're always sort of exploring the edges of their niche and slipping into new niches from time to time. And again, I think it's kind of a symbiotic thing where the nervous system and the behavior and the opportunities kind of have to be approached all at once. You get larger, there's certain things that become possible for you.
One of the things I want to talk about too, we've talked about foraging and feeding behavior, but another very fundamental behavior that we've only just briefly touched on is defensive behaviors on the one hand and escape behaviors, say from predators on the other hand. So even before the animals we normally think about every day evolved, before there were mammals, before there were dinosaurs and stuff, you had more primitive organisms, and they still had to follow concentration gradients to find, where the nutrients were in the environment, and they still had to avoid predators. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about escape and predator avoidance in some of the early chordates, maybe, and how that helps us think about, or sets the stage for helping us think about more complex behaviors. So, for example, even a very, very simple animal that has the ability to swim through the water, even if it doesn't really have eyeballs in the way that we have eyeballs, even if it doesn't have what we would call the most sophisticated nervous system, it still has to sense danger on one side of its body and then move in the opposite direction. So before we start talking about things like spatial navigation and cognition and all that, how do some of these early primitive escape behaviors start to set the stage for how some of those more complex forms of mobility?
Well, so one of these major periods of innovation was the Cambrian explosion, and one proposal is that the reason for the Cambrian explosion was predation. That essentially mobile animals, a number of them stumbled onto the benefits of becoming predators. So jellyfish had been predators already before then, or things like jellyfish. But sometime around the Cambrian, arthropods, or certain mollusks and such, it's unclear exactly what they were, but there were some large predators that appear in the fossil record. And that puts a lot of pressure on everybody else, right? Perhaps around that time, you get a lot of innovation in the vertebrates. So the cephalochordates already had an escape reaction that, again, with that single eye patch, essentially just if a shadow falls on you, swim like crazy, or hide in the ground, hide in the sand, even better, right? And that's a very simple policy that deals with lots of situations. And again, it may be completely benign, but better be safe than sorry. So you don't have to be too sophisticated. But in vertebrates, what happens is that the eye patch split into two that migrated to the sides of the head. So now you can have a differential shadow, and now you can swim away from the shadow. You can now orient yourself away from the shadow. And one proposal is that because the projections from the eyes cross in the brain when they get to the midbrain, the tectum, they cross. And then from then downstream into the spinal cord, they don't cross in the escape system. Now, I didn't know this when I was studying neuroscience. First, I thought things cross on the input and then cross again on the output. And that's true for many systems. But for the escape system, it actually doesn't cross. So now what you have is a system that if you have a stronger stimulus on one side, it's going to cause more contraction on the other side. And so you'll turn away from that stimulus, at least initially, and then you just swim like hell. But because you orient yourself away from the stimulus, it gives you that extra edge to get away from that predator. Now, of course, the predators are getting better at it too. And they actually have, so the approach system, that's the avoidance system. The approach system actually is double crossed again. And so now, a stronger stimulus on one side will have you turn towards it. So if you recognize prey, you use that. If you recognize threat, you use the escape system. And this is something that's been documented very well in lamprey, and fish and birds and mammals, you name it. So these systems exist in all vertebrates, probably through common descent from our common ancestor with lamprey, which was about 550 million years ago. Cambrian explosion time. So that's a very simple mechanism. It's not navigation. It's not really knowledge about the world. It's really relatively simple, reflex-like interaction to again avoid a state of threat, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And so, how do we start to think about the transition from mostly or purely reflexive behaviors that can be very simple in the ways that you just described, detect one type of stimulus at one side of the body and then simply execute an escape behavior or some other very stereotyped behavior? How do we start to think about the emergence of structures in the brain that have much more refined capabilities and that when we start to use words like representation, for example? How do we start to think about this?
Well, first of all, the reflex that I'm describing is actually not the start of behavior so much, but rather a necessary step that becomes particularly necessary once you get big predators roaming around. The fundamental thing is really the motivated, sort of internally motivated behavior, like, boy, my nutrients are running low, better get out there and forage. So that's really and that's really why I think what a lot of people think about in terms of goal-directed, motivated behavior as being more sophisticated than reflexive. But again, I think actually that is really the foundation. Reflexive is just a kind of a special case. This kind of escape reflex is kind of a special case that has to become particularly sort of fast in kind of stimulus response type scenario, simply because being eaten is really bad. But for more regarding representation now, okay, so now imagine you have these two eye patches that tell you there's more threat on the right, go to the left. You can do better than that if you actually have your eye patch sort of topographically project downstream so that the particular location in a particular part of external space is now conveyed downstream, so that you turn away not just from there's more stuff on the right, but exactly where it is, right? It actually tells you now, turn by this angle in order to orient yourself away from the threat, or turn by a different angle, simply by maintaining a topography between the sensor and the downstream and the midbrain tectum, and then downstream projections to the spinal cord. And so that's, you could, if you wanted to, call that a kind of representation of space. It's kind of like a sensor for threats in particular locations around you. But the distinction between being a sensor versus a motor structure is still not really justified there, because it really is a sensorimotor control circuit. It's a dynamical system with coupling between variables that essentially just gets the task done. Never mind whether it's a representation of the stimulus or a representation of a motor plan, right? That debate is not relevant at that stage. So I think, you can talk about it. So the term representations, as you know, is a real problem in the field. And mostly, I think, because people mean different things by it. What I find useful, and there's, of course, a huge debate. There's camps that believe everything the brain does is manipulation of representations, be they symbolic or distributed. And another camp that says, no, representations are not allowed. We have to talk about behaviors, etc. I'm sort of in the middle. I think it's useful maybe to think about them as a kind of a continuum. So on the one end, you can imagine representations are purely descriptive. And so it's things like, when I write something on a piece of paper, a phrase, that's a representation that describes something only because you know how to read that language, et cetera, and you have things in your head. It's sort of decodable. It's sort of a code that you know how to decode, and so it's useful for me to pass messages to you in this way, right? And that's a kind of a descriptive representation. I can draw a picture of something. It's not that thing, right? And so that's a kind of representation that people often talk about. Then there's representations that are pragmatic, like, for example, this sort of topographic projections from retina to tectum to spinal cord, right? It's not about knowledge per se. It's about getting the task done, right? It's getting the escape behavior working well. And it doesn't matter whether it's decodable or not, right? It doesn't matter. It'd be very hard for an external, a scientist to decode specifically how a particular cell along that pathway encodes location and space, because it's distributed and it's extremely context dependent, right? It might differ based on the state of the animal. And it's not really decodable, but it's certainly not decoded by any other part of the brain. It's just part of a system that accomplishes a goal. It's pragmatic, right? And so that's a very different kind of representation, right? It's not about conveying knowledge. It's about co-varying with the world in a way that produces useful behavior. And so I think, but we can still talk about it as a representation, because really that's very often what people mean. So when people in neuroscience, record in the brain of a mouse or a human, and they see activity that co-varies with something, they say it's a representation. But do they really mean that it's decoded by some other brain region in some way, and there's a language in which it's expressed, or do they really mean that it's just part of a control circuit? And I can tell you, in the motor field, people tend to think of it, well, no, it's downstream activity that activates muscles. It's not necessarily a decodable trajectory in Cartesian space or something. Even if we can decode it, that's not really what the brain is doing. So that's how some people talk about representations. Others are really talking about much more like a message passing between modules, little bits of knowledge that are encapsulated some way, encoded by the perceptual system, then sent over to some cognitive executive that decodes it, does something with it, and then encodes a motor plan and sends it downstream. That's a different way of thinking about it, right? Now, the big question, of course, has to do with where we lie along that continuum. And I think it's useful to think about it as a continuum, because then we can ask the question, which I'm interested in, is suppose you have these animals swimming around and running around the world that mostly have pragmatic representations, and that's what they need to do. Ultimately, everything in the brain has to serve some purpose, or it's a waste. So in the end, you have to do something, even if it's knowledge, right? But how do you go from something which is purely pragmatic to something that's increasingly descriptive, right? The kinds of things that do seem to exist in more sophisticated behavior and more sophisticated animals. And certainly by the time you get to language and humans or human abstract thinking and such, those things are quite descriptive. But how do you get from one to the other? And I think you have to have a story of how you get there, because you can't just have cognition pop in suddenly in an evolution and just be connected to all the other systems perfectly. It has to come somehow from within, right? From within an interacting system. And so, for example, I can go on about this for hours, but one example is symbol grounding. So there's a classic problem in philosophy and sort of cognitive science about if the brain works by manipulating representations that are symbolic, but even non-symbolic, how do we attach meaning to those symbols? So you have a word, dog. How is that attached to the meaning of dog, all the various aspects of that phrase? And that's a tough problem to solve. But there's another way of looking at it, which again comes from things like affordances and sensorimotor control, etc. And Giovanni Pizzullo calls this the symbol detachment problem. So what he suggests is that you have interacting systems that are essentially pragmatic, what I would call pragmatic representation. So there's animals that are interacting with the world. They're making use of affordances. They're engaging in closed loop interactive control, etc. And the question is, and that's meaningful because again, it accomplishes those goals like maintaining your state. So the meaning is there sort of trivially, in the sense that it has purpose for the animal. Then the question is how, within the context of these interacting systems, you have part of it specialized to sort of get detached from the moment-to-moment activity. Like, for example, a thing in the brain that doesn't just say, there's a threat on my right, but says, hey, that's a lion. That's a lion and it's charging at me, right? Now, strictly speaking, to escape the lion, you don't need that knowledge, but we do actually have that knowledge. There is something in the brain that sort of describes the situation to us, usually long after we've escaped, hopefully. But the point is that we are capable of this. And how does it get detached? And I think that's an interesting question. And I'll stop me if I'm going too long, by the way, but there's one example that I would give for that for early animals, and that's in navigation. So if you're not in a desirable part of the environment, and let's say you don't have any food around you, then you may want to navigate around. You may want to swim around and find where there is more food. And as you swim, there's certain cues that you have from the environment, olfactory, odor plumes and such, and as well as visual landmarks that are sort of reliably tied into particular feeding sites, like, I don't know, some piece of coral where there's some plant that you might want to that you could eat that provides food for you. And so when you're in that motivated, hungry state, you can swim around and incorporate in your hunger satisfaction behavior, incorporate these cues, such as, for example, if these two visual features are located one to the right to the other, then I need to keep swimming until the one they switch, so that it's kind of landmarks can kind of triangulate kind of where you are, and that's a useful sort of transformation in the world that's pertinent for you to find food when you're hungry, right? And so essentially the animal could learn when it's in this state of being hungry and searching for food, it can learn what are the places in the world that satisfy its hunger. And it's purely pragmatic. It's not sort of decodable because it's all tied in together. The visual, the olfactory, and the internal state are all mixed up together into this kind of system where it's non-decodable, right? But now, if you have such a system that can learn where the food is, it becomes useful to detach the internal state aspect from all the other aspects, right? Because those other aspects, like the relative location of landmarks or odor plumes, are still there even when you're not hungry, right? So that means that even if you're not, if you have the ability to build what this is would be called a cognitive map, that you can build a sort of a map of your environment and sort of tag it with, this is where there's some food, here's where there's some shelter, etc. In the context of particular control policies like find the food or find the shelter. But if you can detach that internal aspect of it, like I'm hungry or I'm threatened, and just focus on the external part, on those external transformations and such, then you can learn that cognitive map in general, right? You can learn a more general map. And even when you're swimming around, just sort of swimming around idly, you're not hungry, you're not threatened, you can still use and construct that information somehow, and that becomes a kind of knowledge. And so again, you're now detaching sort of a more descriptive thing that is more like knowledge of the world from a purely pragmatic thing that was all about satisfying the need for, feeding yourself, etc. So I think that might be an example, and it's probably a very old one. Again, early vertebrates probably were capable of doing this kind of context, maybe not independent, but more
detached from the
more
one
detached
context. Yeah.
Exactly.
So let me see if I can sort of summarize some of this and riff on it. So if we imagine a primitive organism like a lamprey or something, it's got primitive sensory abilities in the sense that it's not as sophisticated as us. It maybe can't form images the way we can. An organism that can just sort of detect light or not light. It can detect the presence of a looming shadow. It's got muscles. It can move its body and swim around. So if we imagine the escape system of this animal, then it's doing something like, if shadow is present, wiggle the body so that we swim in the opposite direction, and that's its escape behavior. It doesn't have anything that we would call a rich representation of what the threat is. It's not identifying, that predator versus another predator. It's simply detecting the presence of a looming shadow, which is present right now in this context. And then it's, like a stimulus response reflex, just executing a simple behavior that will reliably move the animal out of harm's way. And that can be a very simple, powerful circuit for a relatively primitive organism to use to promote survival. And I think one thing that you said is important is when we think about a circuit like that, a set of circuits like that, I think what you were saying is they just need to get the job done. And one thing that means is that as long as they get the job done and the animal survives and that circuit fulfills that basic escape function, there's nothing necessitating that the way it gets the job done, the way that the information is being encoded, is efficiently, in the computational sense, decodable by other circuits in the brain.
Yeah.
And that all of that's very different from some of the things that evolve later, where you want to encode things in a way that is decodable elsewhere, because it starts to allow you for this detachment of the state from the current context, and that allows for more generalization and new types of learning. Is that
yes?
Is that roughly what you were saying?
That's roughly it. And you can think that how much more sophisticated we are than lamprey, but we have that same circuit. If a large vehicle moves in your peripheral vision, you're going to escape, and it's thanks to your superior colliculus that you're going to do that. And you don't care if it's a Ford truck or a Mack truck. It's a large looming stimulus, and you just get the hell out of there. And that's that is a fast system, and it's good that it's there. Now, yes, as you say, for other kinds of things, especially generalization, you don't want to have things that are so inextricably tied into one particular context, because then, of course, by definition, won't generalize. So I think that happens in many of these systems. But I wonder whether it happens, and I don't know what the answer is, but I wonder whether it tends to happen by differentiation and specialization. So in other words, you don't want to mess up the system that gives you that fast escape. You don't want to mess with that. However, if you duplicate it and then or sort of have a redundant system, then you can keep relying on the old one while playing around and making the other one more sophisticated. So the telencephalon did not play a big role in early chordates. Well, there wasn't much of it, apparently, in early chordates. But once you get to vertebrates, you get much of the telencephalic structures there, including what appears to be the ancestral part of the cerebral cortex, or the precursor. So the basal ganglia is there in lamprey, the pallium, which includes the hippocampus and cerebral cortex in us. These structures are there, and the circuits are largely there. But they didn't play so much of a immediate role in controlling behavior, which was done more by these midbrain circuits. But they had a modulatory role. It's kind of like saying, sort of like collecting information about the state and prioritizing those other systems in a more sophisticated way, modulating the sort of priority between doing one thing versus another thing, but not so much controlling the doing of those things. But gradually, certainly in mammals, it took over much of that role. And that's a whole complicated story that, again, can only make sense in the context of the actual history that we went through, becoming nocturnal and then sort of relying on a different circuits more than reptiles that dominated diurnal life. So there's certain sort of things that happened along the way that led to these parts of the brain becoming highly elaborate, and eventually taking over. But again, we still have all those escape circuits in there. In some ways more sophisticated even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to riff on this a little bit more, if we use the lion example, you can imagine a simple version of ourselves that, a lion jumps out of a bush and you run away. If you just have the sort of basic escape circuit, you're sort of just saying, threat is here, get away from it. But as soon as organisms evolve the ability to start encoding different information in different ways and at different time scales, you have that detachment of the current state from the stimulus. So now I can get away from the lion, I can reach safety, my flight or flight state can go away because now I'm safe, and I can say, there was this thing that I'm representing as a lion somehow. I'm representing it in the absence of the thing being there. I'm representing it in the absence of me being in the flight or fight state. And what that actually buys me is the ability to avoid going back into that state in the future, because now I can think, well, if I go over there, that thing might be there, and I better not do that. Is that, am I sort of repeating that in an okay way?
Yeah. I think, in one very simple sense, even with that representing, if you've just been exposed to a threat and you got away from it, you may want to continue being very sensitive to threats, and don't engage in other activities. You just escaped from a lion. Oh, and here's a nice fruit to eat. No, well, maybe don't eat the fruit just yet. Maybe stay alert a bit, a kind of a state of what one might call anxiety, right? You're sort of predisposed to continue escaping in case that predator comes after you or is still there, So I think there's a sort of a kind of it doesn't have to be very sophisticated. It could be simply like a prolonged change in the modulation of different circuits, again, and you can imagine this is also physiological, right? The heart rate goes up, the pupils dilate, etc. You become very alert, etc. That doesn't yet require a detached representation per se. But like in the other example that I gave, you may nevertheless learn where the lions live. This hill over there is kind of off limits because there's danger there, and so you may want to you may want to assimilate that particular scenario to a larger context that becomes a different other policies. Like, yes, okay, there's no lion, there's no threat, and I'm hungry, but still you don't want to go down over that hill because, again, that's where threats are. So I think that's part of making behavior more sophisticated. I'm not sure it's necessarily decodable yet, though, right? I think this is one of the things. So one of the things that's going on in neuroscience now is everybody's trying to decode neural activity. And we can do it when we control everything like crazy, right? When we control every contextual variable, then we can decode. But the problem is they're all mixed. The variables are all mixed up there in ways that are hard to make sense of. So even though you and I might say, well, the brain has to represent the location of the target in order to reach for it. Well, what it really needs to do is reach the target. And the pragmatic circuits along the way will definitely have to co-vary in a sort of a lawful way with the location of the target, but they may not be decodable in any straightforward way. And even if they are, there's still this aspect of context, right? Which is there, and I think we won't understand the system unless we kind of confront that sort of mixed up, context-dependent, pragmatic way that the brain does, that much of the brain activity actually is. This is something I think that, again, in sensorimotor control, people sort of confront that a lot because the questions are so intertwined. If you study purely sensory systems, you can get by, I think, without confronting the contextual things. But again, only so far. I think people there are also coming to similar conclusions. And again, I think we have this idea of the brain encoding things and decoding it like a message passing, because a lot of people sort of come to it with a kind of a metaphor of a computer where you really do have information encoded and decoded. But there's not that much in the brain, I think, that works that way.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly remember, when I was doing neuroscience, and many people have had the experience where, you set up an experiment, you record from some neurons, and, you're trying to understand, you're trying to decode what the neurons are doing. There's this sort of expectation sort of baked in and often just sort of brought in as an assumption that everything should be decodable. But what you're saying is that much of it probably isn't in the sense that we might find convenient.
Yeah, I mean, mostly in the sense that it's mixed, right? So if you control, if let's say you have a pragmatic system and it's coupled to the environment in a way that accomplishes some relatively sophisticated and complex goal, it's going to co-vary with many variables. And if you control, let's say it co-varies with 10 different variables that one can conceive. If you control 9 of them, then you'll be able to decode the 10th. Yes. But in natural behavior, that's usually not the case. The things actually all co-vary. They're not actually constant. The other variables are not constant. And so, when we look at this, when we record in the brain, we very often find very nice correlations between neural activity and some externally definable quantity. Sometimes very, very external, like physically, like a physical variable like movement, but sometimes there's a conceptual variable, like, let's say, the reward value of performing a certain movement. But the fact is, these things are all mixed up, and often in ways that are hard to make sense. And I think one of the reasons, again, that it's hard to make sense of is start with a model that is incorrect, that we think that the brain is composed of modules that are sort of sending coded messages to each other. And if we could just decode them, we would understand it. But that's not really what's going on at all. Again, like in that escape circuit, it's not coded messages. It's interactions. I sometimes joke that we know exactly what every neuron encodes. What every action potential encodes. It encodes the synaptic input to the next neuron, right? The problem, of course, is that there's millions of those next neurons. They're all linked together in a recurrent network, and so it's not a very useful thing to say after that. But I think if we have models of, first of all, what the system is really doing, what task it's really accomplishing, then we can start making experiments that say, well, why should this thing be mixed up in this way? And it turns out that often it is, and this is, I think, what I get excited about is if we can develop a model that, let's say, says, well, so I'll give you an example from our work where we look at the sensorimotor control of reaching movements in the context of making decisions, right? And we see things, for example, that co-vary with the direction of a movement that a monkey's about to make. But it also co-varies with the reward that the monkey is likely to receive for performing that movement, but only when there's a decision to be made, right? So in the part of the region that I'm talking about here, premotor cortex, you have neural activity that co-varies and predicts the movement that an animal will make. And in the case of a situation where he's making a decision between two different movements, it co-varies with the reward associated, the relative reward of a movement. So cells that prefer this movement will be more strongly active if that movement is more rewarded than another. And so you could say it encodes movement direction and encodes reward size, right? But if you have only a single target, then these very same cells completely don't encode the reward. So the monkey, of course, still cares about whether he receives 1 drop of juice or 3 drops of juice, but the neurons no longer report it. They don't correlate. They don't encode that variable. And why is that? Well, because I don't think they're ever really encoding variables. What I think is that they are implementing a system that implements a competition essentially between different actions, and that competition is biased by all the things that would make you want to go one way versus another, including reward. But because when that competition exists, you're going to see that biasing. But when there's a single target, there's no competition, and so you just go to that target, and so the encoding now of reward is gone. And it's not mysterious in any way once you describe it that way, right? It's kind of like obvious. Well, sure, it's going to co-vary with these variables because what it's doing is the pragmatic thing, right? Which is, of all the places I could go, I could move my arm. Which is the place that I want to move my arm? And that's going to depend on reward, effort, what's available, etc. And again, it's not representing, it's doing, right? It's not trying to describe the movement to somebody. It's just trying to send this input to the next neurons down the line such that the arm happens to go in that good direction, in the best direction.
Let's using this behavioral example from monkeys, I want to talk about so the way that many people talk about the brain, that many people naturally think about the brain, is we sort of completely parse it into these different functional segments. You've got some circuits that are sensory, and they give us sensations, and then some circuits after that, they grab that information from the sensory neurons, and then they do perception. They create our perceptions, and then our perceptions go on to other circuits, and cognition happens, and eventually we make a decision. And then those cognitive circuits hand it off to the motor neurons, and then a behavior is executed. This sort of serial model of very functionally distinct types of circuits, one after the other, doing these different types of operations. And I think what you're saying is that's a poor way to think about it. So can you talk about that a little bit more, and maybe reiterate the the monkey reaching experiments you were talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's more general than those experiments. There's yes, you're right, and that's how people very often approach the problem, and it's a traditional way of approaching the problem. And I've often wondered why. Where does that idea actually come from? I mean, if we've been, we usually like to cite people when we when we start with some ideas, but who do we cite for that one? I don't. And I actually think this is very pre-scientific fundamentally. That back when people first started thinking about the mind and the soul, right? It was essentially assumed that they're separate, that there's a mind that's separate from the body, right? And if you believe that, which pretty much everyone did, at least among the Greeks like Plato and Aristotle. Then you're forced to consider how that mind interacts with the world. It needs an interface. It needs a way for the world to learn about the world, and that's what perception is. It presents the world to the mind, but also has to exert its will, preferably free will, onto the world through action, right? And so the very concepts of perception and action and intention, etc., were sort of developed in our thinking at a time where everyone was essentially a dualist, and there was no problem being a dualist, right? And it was really a very long time until the concept of this non-physical mind was eventually abandoned by most, not by everyone. But at that point, it was already kind of too late, right? What happened is these concepts of a perceptual system and an action system that plays out the wishes, those were retained, and the non-physical mind was just replaced with a physical thing, which people said, you know what? We can replace the mind with something like a computer, right? Which implements very sophisticated behavior if you give it the right inputs and produces the right outputs. We can just plug it right in there and replace this thing, because this concept of a non-physical mind was very uncomfortable in light of physics and science, et cetera. It was not compatible with the laws of physics, et cetera. So it was problematic for psychology. But because they could just replace it with this cognition module, it solved the problem, right? But the problem it didn't solve is those interfaces that I think we're so ingrained in even the way we talk about behavior, or we describe something to each other. It's so ingrained in our way of thinking that it was impossible to let it go, right? And so now we have not only is there conceptual boundaries, but there are specializations. I mean, different people study different systems. There are people who study perception who don't worry about the cognitive issues, and there are people who study motor control who don't worry about the perceptual issues, et cetera. And there are people who study cognition who don't worry about how the input is constructed. They just they begin with the assumption that I'm going to receive this really nice model of the world, and now my job is to explain how the brain does interesting cognitive things with that model of the world. But if you look at people who study sensorimotor control in animals, oculomotor control or swimming behavior, there's none of that there, right? There's no real separation. You still talk about sensors and effectors. You still talk about a kind of a specialization for certain kinds of activity patterns versus others. There's information that about the world which is ambiguous as to what you're going to do in the world, but in the end, you can only do one or two things at once. And so in the end, it sort of has to change into a more sort of motor related format, but you don't have to draw those borders. And I think what happened in psychology is because psychology became a science at a time that those borders were already pretty much set in stone in our language of even the terminology that we use, that it started from that point, and it's very difficult to snap out of it. And this is one of the things that I think Gibson did, and Bill Powers and Piaget and many others suggested we need to get rid of that baggage and start thinking about it as a system. And then we can talk about how different parts of the system do different things, because you can still talk about things that are, things that are closed loop sensory motor control in the here and now versus things that are not, things that are more, detached, again, from the moment to moment. So I think a number of people have been saying that for a long time. And it's penetrated a little bit here and there in the field, but I still think that most people come into the field with such a strong preconceived notion that, I'm going, this mystery of perception is so fascinating. That's what I'm going to study. I can tell you, when I got into this, right, I came in from a computer science background. So I was completely thinking in this way, right? And I was thinking to myself when I went to graduate school, and I went to the group of Steve Grossberg, who's a computational modeler. And I was thinking, I'm going to address the attention problem, the perception problem, because it's just so interesting, right? But one of the things that I learned from my professors there is, again, about Gibson and ecological psychology. And it was Ennio Mingola and Daniel Bullock that really exposed me to these ideas. And I thought, wow, there's another way of thinking about it. You don't have to think about, I'm going to study how perception works and how it produces that internal model of the world. I can talk about sensory motor control and the whole problem of behavior, because there is an alternative way of thinking about it, which doesn't require drawing these borders and then looking for these modules. And I think, again, lots of people have said this. A lot of people continue to say it, but I still think that there is this prevalent notion out there that a lot of people just assume it just is the case, and they don't encounter ideas that say otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is very natural to think that way.
It is.
Although, of course, funny enough, if you think about it, when do we have perceptions in the absence of cognition, or vice versa?
It's well, not that's obvious, one place actually, where people have noted very much, that the border between those two is pretty blurry. And likewise in motor control, if you look at decision making, if you look at studies of decision making, very often, if you study decisions about action, it's all right in the same regions that control the actions, right? In monkeys or mice, etc. I mean, if you study decisions that are very abstract, then it's rather different, right? I mean, that's not the same type of thing. But if you study decisions about actual activity, they seem to emerge within what one would normally have called the motor system, or at least the sensory motor system. And not in some purely cognitive thing, right? It's the borders between these terms in the brain are extremely blurry. And I agree, it's very natural to think that way, but I think we need to just confront the fact that as soon as you look at the brain, it just ain't so. Even in functional imaging studies, where there's really very little action, because otherwise you'll have artifacts and you won't be able to do your experiment. Even in those studies, you see all these things mixed up in very confusing ways that just don't obey the traditional psychological distinctions. But again, I would say, if these ideas are so old, what's the chance that that the Greeks had it right back then? I mean, they were brilliant, but they didn't have the knowledge that we have now that we could use to come up with better terminologies.
What circuits in the brain performing what kinds of functions do you think are going to be the most decodable? So in this, meaning that, what circuits in the brain performing what kind of functions have to perform those functions specifically so that they can be easily decoded by other circuits in the brain? What types of behaviors do you think these are going to be tied to? What types of circuits in the brain would you expect us to be able to find things that are supposed to be decoded, so to speak?
Well, I would say maybe none, right? Because there's no reason for the brain to decode itself, right? The brain, in the end, its job is to get behavior, get on with the task of behavior, right? There is no it's not necessarily true that one part of the brain has to be able to decode another. So it has to deal with behavior. But I do think that there are some aspects of behavior which have to be, at least at the behavioral level, decodable. And language would be the most extreme example of that, right? Language is a very important and interesting case for a number of reasons. But one, I think, a mistake that's often made, in my opinion, a mistake, is that we use the question of language to determine how we think about everything the brain does. And so language involves, symbolic communication and certain kinds of rules, and very, very detached from sensorimotor. And so, the idea of passing messages between you and me is then absorbed into the idea of how the brain works, where, the amygdala sends coded messages to the striatum or something. I don't think one should take that as whatever is appropriate for explaining language may not be appropriate for explaining the rest of the brain. And it shouldn't be the basis of our theories. And I say all this because it was, right? Language was one of the reasons why people abandoned a lot of the ideas of behaviorists and ethologists and went with a more representation-heavy architectures, like in cognitive science. And it was because people wanted to explain language. But the other thing I want to say about language is that I don't think actually language itself is really fundamentally a message passing or an information passing system. I actually think language is yet another extension of control, just happens to pass through other creatures, right? So I can control my physiological state with internal variables and internal processes. I can control my state in the environment by moving around in that environment and acting in it, and pushing on objects and taking advantage of the reliable consequences of performing one action versus another. Laws of, like, if I move forward, things in front become reachable. That's an obvious thing. But there's also laws of interaction, right? If I'm a helpless baby, I can't control my state. I can't do anything about my state, but I have a parent there in the next room or next to me who will take care of stuff for me as long as I, utter the correct sound. And frankly, in the beginning, it doesn't have to even be correct. It could just be any sound. The parent will come and figure out what's wrong and figure out what to do for me. And then eventually I can maybe make a more specific sound to indicate one need versus another need. And the parent will go and happily, fulfill that need and do whatever it takes. And again, the nice thing about parents is that they're really quite sophisticated, but incredibly easy to control if you're their baby, right? A baby can make the parent do anything, right? And I know because I have a son and I've been in his control for a long time now. So the thing is, that's kind of a kind of communication, right? And the parent gradually shapes the utterances of the baby to fine-tune that interaction and that control that the baby has, again, happily, right? But it also extends in other situations. A animal can make a threatening gesture to another animal, and if that threatening gesture makes that other animal back off, great. Then you've exerted control without having to engage in fighting and injuring yourself. You've exerted control over your rival, and you accomplished what you wanted, which is, let's say, staying as the alpha male or getting some piece of food that somebody else was trying to get from you. And so you make gestures or you make utterances to control others. Now, in humans, that just explodes in complexity, right? And so human societies, frankly, primates too, even monkeys have pretty sophisticated interactions, a lot of gestures, but also utterances that are essentially not about, decoding intentions. It's about persuading the others. It's controlling the others and thereby my access to things like food, mates, the nice, comfy perch or whatever. And I think that's the foundation of communication. And then language really, and then again, we can sort of think about the detachment within that, right? So I'm controlling my conspecifics by making various utterances, but as my control over those conspecifics opens, and here again, Umwelt, right? The idea that once you have these kinds of interactions and they respond in predictable ways to me and vice versa, now it creates a whole new domain, a whole new like aspect of the niche that can explode in complexity, and everybody can discover more and more sophisticated ways to deal with that new environment, kind of new aspect of the environment. And I think what happened in human society is that's what we excelled in so much. We're like the hummingbirds of language, right? We're just incredibly good at it, so much better than any other animals. Just like hummingbirds are amazing at flying, right? And so we've taken that to new levels, and such levels of complexity that we can do things that are really very far detached from simple interactions. We can have long range plans. We can deposit money in a bank to buy food, 20 years from now, and control my state, etc. And so I think a lot of it comes with that social structure and tied into language. And there, I think, so coming back very roundabout way to your question about decodable, there's an example where you actually want to make the utterances decodable by the listener, etc. And there it actually becomes very important that things are explicit and abstract and detached. Inside the brain, maybe also. I mean, you mentioned earlier the idea of generalization. I think that's an example where, context dependence gets you into trouble if you want to generalize. So this idea of separating out from this pragmatic mixture may be relevant there. I'm not sure though decodable. I mean, does any part of the brain, how is it in the business of decoding another? I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's good examples of that.
So, you mentioned earlier how seductive the question or the problem of perception is, because I mean, it's such an intrinsic part of our lives, and it's so naturally interesting. Why is it that we perceive things? Why is it that we have conscious perceptions at all? And so when I think about, the question, what is perception? Where do they come from? An answer that you commonly hear to that is some version of, well, perceptions are your brain's representations of the external world per se. With some level of fidelity, you're representing what's actually in the outside world. So my question for you is simply, what is perception? But I'll also add the additional question, do you even think that's a good question to ask?
Yeah, I do actually think it's a good question to ask. And I think the answer that I like is kind of based on Milner and Goodale's work on the two visual streams, which I think actually generalizes to many sensory systems. And so what they point out is that, well, actually it was Ungerleider and Mishkin that pointed out the anatomical separation between a dorsal visual system, which is sensitive to the space around you, and a ventral visual system, which is sensitive to object identity. And not so much the space around you. What Milner and Goodale suggested is that the dorsal system, the spatial system, is really about sensorimotor control. It's the front end to the circuits that make you move around in space and reach things and run around and control your action. Where the ventral system is more about what we normally think of perception, which is being aware, identifying things, classifying them, So for example, you can hide under something without having any idea of what it is. You can grasp all kinds of objects, whether or not you know that they're edible or not, right? So and that's dorsal, that's dorsal system processing. You can interact, you can perceive the affordances and take advantage of them in all kinds of sophisticated ways without actual knowledge of what the thing is that you're grabbing. But so, for example, a heavy object can be used on all kinds of ways: to hammer a nail, to throw at an intruder, to hold down pieces of paper flying around on my desk, etc. It has affordances and whatever, but it also has identity that more specifically says something about it. Like the better example is really a fruit, right? There's all kinds of spherical objects you can grasp, but some of them are edible, right? And so you want to grasp them when you're hungry, and you want to then bring them to your mouth and eat them, right? And the proposal is that the ventral stream is identifying the identity of objects in order to help you decide about what you want to do in the world around you and which things you want to bother grabbing. There might be all kinds of spheres around in your world, but one of them happens to be an apple. If you can identify which one is an apple, that's the one you want to orient to. And so that, I think, is, and in fact, in many disorders, people can have one or the other system damaged. So they're unable to identify what the object is, but they can still interact with it, or vice versa. And so I think what you mentioned as sort of what we think about perception is more this ventral stream stuff, that we are very concerned with the identity of objects. And it's because we're going to use that information to make a sort of a high level control policy of, do I want to approach this thing or reach for it or whatever? It's whereas the other system is more like, here's all the possible things you could do right now. Here's a whole bunch of things you could grasp. Here's a whole bunch of places you could walk. Here's some support surfaces, some things you can hide under. Here's the opportunities for you, sort of large menu of opportunities. But the brain can only do a couple of things at once. So in the end, it has to kind of prioritize. And so this ventral stream processing helps you do that and then select out which of the things is more appetizing or whatever. And I think that's one of the systems that really takes off in primates. That ventral stream is pretty small in rodents and tree shrews and other sort of our relatively nearby cousins. It's not as elaborate as it is in primates. It's extremely elaborate in primates, in part, I think, because primates sort of, at least along our lineage, became very visually driven animals. Vision became extremely important, and their lifestyle was one in which you don't approach things, sniff them, taste them. You look at them from one tree away, and then you decide whether you want to go bother, going to that other tree and eat those fruit over there. So I think a lot of our sophisticated visual system is still doing all the sensorimotor stuff, but then there's this other system which is becoming, and you can already see how that's a bit more symbolic, a bit more probably context independent, and so you have all kinds of you have all kinds of processing along that system, which is all about classification and drawing boundaries between, there can be lots of apples in a whole continuum of sort of nutritiousness. Some are rotten, some are perfectly ripe. You need to draw a border because you need to make a decision. Are you going to eat it or you're not going to eat it? And so you want to classify them into, this is good, this is not good, etc. And so classification and sort of breaking up the world into categories is sort of that part of the visual system. Again, because it has to do things like prioritize actions and decide which of many affordances you want to take part in. And I think a lot of that is what we're more sort of consciously aware of. Whatever conscious awareness is, it seems to be more focused on that kind of vision.
What was that text you mentioned earlier, Perception, the Control of Behavior?
That was Bill Powers from 1973, I think, or 71, early 70s. And that's called perceptual control theory. And there's essentially a kind of a tradition of people who think this way. And I have a lot in common with them with that. Again, he's not the only one who has said this. He said it particularly nicely, I think. But Piaget, Jean Piaget, who was a very influential psychologist in the mid 20th century, he said something like this about cognition as well. He talked about child development and suggesting that the child first figures out how to move around and flop around and control his arms and etc. Only later does he construct actual knowledge of the world that he's interacting with on that foundation. And that foundation is kind of necessary to have cognition. And he was very much a cognitive psychologist, but he was a cognitive psychologist who focused very much on really the pragmatic aspects and kind of the control aspects as well. But again, others have said this too. Newell, no, not Newell. I'm blocking on the name, but John Dewey said this in the 19th century. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if Democritus said it in 500 BC.
So why, on the subject of conscious perception, and if we think of perception in the way that you've been talking about as about being about the control of behavior, do you have a viewpoint on why there needs to be conscious perception at all? Why something like that would have evolved? Why not just have it all be? Is it possible for it to have been a completely sort of automatic, if very complex, system? Why is there such a thing as conscious perception? Can you speculate on that for us?
I gotta say, I have no idea. I gotta say that is a tough question. And very often I come back to it myself. It's like, okay, well and good, sensory control, whatever. But why is there this conscious aspect to it? I really don't know. And there are some promising ideas. I think there are promising ideas out there, but I find them all somewhat unsatisfying in the end. And I'm wondering whether it's because we're just not phrasing it properly. There's a lot of questions that seem completely inaccessible, and then suddenly they're not an issue. Temperature is a sort of a classic example. What is heat, right? And it was just people just didn't have the right concepts to phrase that question correctly, and until it became a non-question. What is life is another one, classic one, right? Why are some things alive and other things inanimate? And people had been wondering about what that elan vital is for centuries. And then a bunch of chemists essentially kind of worked around the problem, and then there was not a problem anymore. For me, the problem of meaning was one of these. I thought to myself when I went to grad school is the great mystery is how is meaning attached to symbols? And I think attacking that head on would take hundreds of years. But then I read Gibson and I realized, that's not the problem at all. It's actually that's because the problem is phrased backwards. That in fact it's not how meaning gets attached to symbols, it's how symbols emerge in pragmatic systems. Now, I don't know what the answer to the question of consciousness is, and I don't think anybody knows. But I suspect it might be one of those types of questions where we're Greeks contemplating galaxies. We just don't have the pieces to frame it correctly. And I'm wondering whether it has something to do with control systems. The idea of being inside versus outside a control system is obviously different. That's like the subjective versus objective perspective. So there's something there. There's some aspect of monitoring. I mean, there's a number of people asking questions like, there's consciousness. Why are we conscious of these things but not these other things? Why is it like, for example, ventral stream stuff seems to be within our consciousness more, whereas dorsal stuff is not? Why? I don't know. I think those are good questions to ask. But it's funny because I've always been interested in this, and I've on and off read what other people say about it. In the end, I'm just never satisfied, and it's a bit of a cop out, admittedly. But I kind of feel like maybe we should think about heat and on life and work at it, and maybe we'll realize it's not a problem. It's not such a problem as we thought if we phrased the question correctly. But I don't know. I don't know. I gotta say it's a quite a deep mystery and a tough one.
Well, Paul, this has been a fascinating conversation so far. Is there anything else you want to say or reiterate to maybe leave people with a distilled version of what we've been talking about and how you think about the brain?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess my one of my frustrations is that that I find that there's a certain mainstream of thinking that is not knowledgeable enough about alternative ways of thinking, simply because once you're in the mainstream, not only you're not forced to go out of it because you're comfortable in it. You can do your work, publish your papers, and get funded. But also you've got a lot to keep up with because everybody's doing these things and everybody's asking the same questions and they want to know what your next input to those questions is. And so I think that happens a lot. But I'm frustrated by having seen how much there is that's out of the mainstream, like Gibson's work, like Powers, like many of these people I've mentioned, that people are not aware of it because they don't go out of their comfort zone. And they just, they read what other people read and they accept the questions that have been handed down to them by, their supervisors in their Psych 101 class. And they just don't realize that there's all these alternative ways of thinking out there, that have actually been around for a while, slogging away in unseen corners. One of the things that I emphasize is evolution is important. There's a huge world of people studying this stuff. And I've always been interested in it, but I only really delved into it deeply recently. And I'm amazed at how my view of everything has changed once I got exposed to this. And so I would say, if you're in the mainstream, you should be worried that you're missing something, that you should go read what everybody isn't reading, and see what the alternatives are, even if many of them are going to be, kind of wacky or wrong-headed. There's some gems out there that people are just not aware of. I was exposed to some of these things because of the particular path I took. If I hadn't, I would not know this stuff. I wouldn't know where to start. So again, I think it's always good to look outside the comfort zone. And again, like I said, I get frustrated how people don't do that. How they just say, "All right, well, this is what everybody else is doing, so let's."
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's great advice. Read outside your comfort zone. I try to read as many things by dead people as I can because sometimes ideas kind of get lost and forgotten about.
Yes,
and,
that's right. That's right. Yeah, I actually also I always thought it would be good to give a assignment to students where they have to write a report and they have to cite from at least 8 different decades, right? And they have to sample across time in a more broad way because you've once you try it, you find that it's there. And I think, to tell you the truth, I think you and others who do these kinds of podcasts or sort of interviews, you're sort of well poised actually to get a broad picture because you're sort of, it's your job to try all these, to sample these things in enough depth to have the conversation, but at the same time without getting so narrowly caught in one particular viewpoint that you're stuck there, right? So you and others who do these kinds of podcasts should all do it for 20 years and then write a nice book.
I'll keep that in mind, but it is true. Yeah, I get a wide sample of things, and yeah, and I often seek people out who are a little bit outside the mainstream, or that who I don't, I just legitimately I don't understand what they're saying, and I want to know more, not because I already think I know the answers of what they're going to say.
Mm-hmm. Well, good, and I look forward to your book.
All right. Well, thanks again, Paul, for your time. This was fascinating, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
All right. Thanks again for inviting me.